How can you calm your feelings, especially feelings like anxiety or fear? Nobody wants to feel anxious or afraid or uncomfortable in any way. So I totally understand why people ask this question, especially anxious people who are dealing with anxiety disorders or chronic states of anxiety. It's not a crime to want to calm down. Today on the Anxious Truth podcast, we're going to look at how to calm your feelings. More accurately, we're going to look at why the usual ways that we try to calm those uncomfortable feelings tend not to work. And then we're going to look at a way that does tend to have good results, except it's much harder to do and takes longer. So let's get to that right now. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Anxious Truth podcast. This is episode 326. We are recording in September of 2025, in case you're listening from the future. I am Drew Linsalata. I'm creator and host of The Anxious Truth. I'm a therapist specializing in the area of anxiety and anxiety disorders in New York. I'm also a former sufferer of the very problems that I talk about on this podcast, though much better now. Three-time author on the topic, social media dude, psychoeducator, advocate, guy with an expensive bike. And today we're going to talk about how to calm your feelings, specifically the feelings that you fear and hate. Now, if you're new to The Anxious Truth and you just stumbled upon this YouTube video or this podcast episode, welcome. I hope you find what we do here to be helpful or useful in some way. And of course, if you are a returning viewer or listener, thanks. I appreciate you hanging out today. We are going to talk about how to calm those feelings that you have come to hate or fear. Except we're going to have to talk about how not to do that before we get to how to do that. But before we get into today's topic, just a very quick reminder that The Anxious Truth is more than just this YouTube video or this podcast episode. If you like what you're hearing here today, you can access a whole lot more stuff on my website at theanxioustruth.com. That includes the books that I've written and very low cost workshops and all the free podcast episodes and videos and social media and all of that good stuff. So check it out. That's all on my website at theanxioustruth.com. If you like this episode or this video, you're going to find a lot more good stuff over there. So avail yourself of the resources. People who do tend to have a lot of good to say about it. Anyway, if all you do is consume this episode or this video or only consume the free stuff, that's totally cool too. No purchase is ever required here. I hope I can help regardless. So let's get into today's topic. And the question at hand today is, how do you calm your feelings, especially the feelings that we hate, like anxiety or fear or sadness or any sort of discomfort or distressing feeling, internal experience, we call them here, that we find unhandleable, distasteful, or even overwhelming. It's a reasonable question to ask, again, because nobody wants to feel these things, and I'm certainly not blaming anybody for wanting to know how to calm their feelings. But before we get to how to calm your feelings, let's take a look at the most popular sort of calming strategies or methods that are put forth and handed to us every day in podcasts or books or videos or in the scroll. Because these tend to not work terribly well for people who listen to this particular podcast or watch this YouTube channel, and that's people who are dealing with anxiety disorders or other chronic forms of persistent anxiety. So let's look at what tends to not work, and I'll try to explain why so that maybe you have a better understanding of why it's sort of not your fault if you're trying these things and you can't seem to conjure instant calm on demand, no matter how much you want it. The first strategy that is usually handed to us when we're trying to calm down from a triggered, anxious, or fearful state is logic. Like, our brains are amazing. We can reason and perform logical operations like nobody's business. It puts us at the top of the food chain. And while certainly dolphins and apes are smart, crows are pretty smart too, from what I understand, they cannot hold a candle to us. We have this incredible logical reasoning, pattern matching, problem solving ability. And when we are triggered into states that we don't want to be in, things like anxiety or fear or sadness or any kind of distressful internal experience, the first thing we tend to turn to and are told to turn to is our ability to use logic, reason, and language to talk ourselves out of those things. But here's the problem. While once in a while you may find a little bit of temporary relief from a triggering thought, say an anxious or intrusive or disturbing thought, or an anxiety symptom that your mind is interpreting as an imminent health threat to you, when you use logic and words and reasoning, sometimes you're able to talk yourself off the ledge. Except when it works, you just have to do it again in an hour or tomorrow or in a couple of days when you're triggered again. There's no lasting impact there. No matter how strong your logic is in any given moment, it doesn't appear to last or be durable from triggered moment to triggered moment. So we just keep repeating that experience again and again. And worse, most of the time that logic doesn't work. Any anxious person will tell you that when they are triggered, the thoughts feels so real. The danger feels so real. The emotions of anxiety and fear, especially, or uncertainty, are so powerful that it feels like there's really a problem here. And just telling yourself that logically it's okay, there's no problem, it's just anxiety, tends to not land. We're trying to operate on sort of parts of our machinery that aren't accessible in those moments and aren't listening to language. So in the heat of the moment, trying to use logic and reasoning, as anybody listening to this podcast can probably attest, rarely works. And again, even when it does, there's no lasting impact and you have to keep trying to talk yourself down. But that's logic, and why logic, words, reasoning, and language, that's handed to us first as a calming strategy, and it tends not to be terribly effective in our context. The second strategy that we're often handed as anxious people who are dealing with anxiety disorders or chronic forms of anxiety is replacement. This usually looks like thought or emotion replacement. Choose a more positive thought. Have a more positive thought. Think happy things. Conjure up positive memories, good feelings, look for gratitude. Like you guys all understand this sort of advice that you're given on a regular basis, often by even qualified helpers and professionals that have the best of intentions. They are telling you to try to replace negative thoughts and emotions and internal experience with more positive ones so that you can knock those out and only feel the good things because you don't want to feel the bad things. And again, I get it. Nobody wants to feel the bad things, but we simply can't do that. No matter how hard we try to conjure positive images of great days in our lives or access the all-powerful gratitude, which evidently is a solution for everything, who knew, right? No matter how often we try to do that or how hard we try to conjure a positive internal experience to replace the negative internal experience that we hate or fear, we tend to fail. Now, why is that? Well, because if you're going to try and replace a negative emotion with a positive emotion, you're going to have to check to see if that works, which means you're looking inward and you're evaluating your internal state. But evaluating your internal state, which is not something that non-anxious people do on the regular, but is something that anxious people get caught up in doing all the time, is a bad idea. So if you're going to try to choose a positive thought or choose gratitude when you're triggered and terrified, you're going to have to check to see if that worked. And when you checked, you found the internal experience that you fear or hate is still there. And then you have to start again. And then you're trying really hard to feel good, even though right now you just feel bad. So for technical reasons, thought replacement and emotion replacement, while it seems like it would be common sense, just simply doesn't work. If anxious people could just choose to think positive thoughts or choose to conjure happy place memories and feel better instantly, well, I wouldn't be here talking into this microphone and this camera. I wish it worked, but it tends not to. And I'm guessing if you're watching or listening today, you've tried this and it isn't working for you. The third strategy that's often handed to an anxious person who wants to calm down on demand is some form of biological or physiological control. Again, this seems to make some sort of sense. Like this strategy involves trying to forcibly gain control over things like hormones or neurotransmitters or, electrical impulses moving across synapses in your brain, some sort of control over some biological or physiological symptom in general. And again, it seems to make sense because if your body is making all these very uncomfortable feelings or physical sensations that you fear or hate or feel are overwhelming or intolerable, it would seem to make sense that you would try to stop it from doing that. The problem here is that we are then confirming to our brains that those physiological states that an anxious body is going to tend to experience are intolerable. They are dangerous. They should never be allowed. That's wrong. Something needs to be fixed and we need to control it at all costs. So we have a bit of an issue here because number one, we are often told to try to control physiology that is simply beyond our control, no matter how much we want it to be. And so the techniques that were handed simply don't work because they were never going to work. Or the second thing that tends to happen is that we wind up turning those things into compulsions or safety behaviors that we have to repeat again and again and again and again. I can only be okay if I have my ice packs. I can only be okay if I can excuse myself and do my tapping. I can only be okay if I can go sit quietly and deep breathe for 10 minutes. And that doesn't tend to work out for us very well because it doesn't let us calm down to live our lives. It forces us to put our lives on pause every time we feel things that we think we're not supposed to feel. Biological control strategies can backfire either because they simply don't work and can make you forcibly draw the conclusion that you're beyond hope and nothing will work for you, or they're just so onerous and restrictive and become ritualized that the negative impact of performing them tends to not outweigh the negative impact of being in the anxious or fearful state to begin with. You're just trading one thing for another. Now, biological control mechanisms that are handed to us can either be natural, and I'm using air quotes if you're listening on the podcast, which the word natural tends to be a bit of a red flag when you're consuming this kind of content or getting this kind of advice, but it's either natural because it grows on a plant, or it's herbal, or it doesn't require anything made by a pharmaceutical company, or the biological control strategy is pharmaceutical in nature. Either one. There's still biological control strategy. Sometimes the natural thing is mistakenly logically presented as, well, it's better because it's natural, because pharma is evil. And while I am not a fan of pharmaceutical companies for a lot of reasons, we can't draw the conclusion that just because something grows on a tree, it will automatically work or actually be effective or help your overall well-being, or maybe not even hurt you, because there's plenty of natural stuff that may have a paradoxical effect, or either doesn't work or could make things worse for you. So either way, whether you are presented biological control strategies that are natural, maybe don't even involve ingesting anything, or involve pharmaceuticals in some way, know that we have a problem here, because they often either don't work or they don't work reliably. And in the case of things like things we ingest, whether they're natural or pharmaceutical, we run the risk of developing psychological dependence, or even in some cases, physical dependence. So when we are trying to calm our feelings, often we are offered biological control strategies that tend to, again, not work so well. Now, a caveat: if you're listening to this podcast or watching this YouTube video and you are using things that you ingest in some way, whether those are pharmaceutical or natural in nature, and you like that and you feel like you have a good quality of life and it's cool, then okay, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I'm just addressing a very large number of people who try biological or physiological control strategies to instantly calm down and don't really have any success at all, or any lasting or durable success, because that is a problem. And again, it makes people draw the conclusion that they're beyond hope and will never get better. And that simply isn't true. And then the last, how do I calm down strategy that we tend to be handed is that of avoidance. If you've ever heard somebody say, you have to really be aware of your triggers so that you can steer clear of them, that's an avoidance strategy. And while often that can be seen in approaches that tell you to cut out the negativity in your life or the toxicity in your life so that you can sort of arrive in Calmville, there are some issues with that. Now, before I continue talking about avoidance-based strategies, let me be very clear that at no time ever on this podcast or in my books or any material that I create am I telling somebody that there's any benefit or virtue to deciding to choose to live in chaos or in unhealthy conditions or in genuinely dangerous conditions or in abusive or environments where you're being mistreated or disrespected. That is not what I'm saying at all. What I am saying, because that's not anxiety recovery, that's not working on your anxiety at all. Like if you're in a genuinely dangerous or threatening or harmful circumstance, well, we do want to avoid that. That's just common sense. But if we're not, and we're just trying to avoid anything outside of us that will trigger things inside of us that we think are unhandleable, unacceptable, intolerable, or overwhelming or too frightening, then avoidance strategy may actually work, except there's a heavy price to pay for that. Avoidance can steer you clear of the things outside of you that trigger the scary things inside of you. But the price we pay for that is seen in things like agoraphobia. If you ask any of agoraphobic what the price is of avoidance run amok, they'll tell you. It's a very small life. And in situations where we've decided that the only way that we're going to try to calm the feelings that we fear and hate so much is to avoid the things that trigger them, you're going to wind up living a life that's very seriously restricted or very small, or at a minimum is very ritualized and based on a very rigid set of rules that often the people around you, your loved ones, your family, your friends, your school, your employer doesn't understand. And then you're in a constant state of conflict because you can only do certain things as long as you are aware that they will not trigger, heaven forbid, an internal experience that you think you should never have to have. So avoidance is one that can work, but it comes at a very heavy price. So when we are trying to learn to calm our feelings, we're often handed these strategies: avoidance, biological control, replacement of thoughts and emotions with more positive thoughts and emotions, or I forget what the first one was. What did I say? Or logic, trying to talk your way out of it. I'm just looking at my notes. So these are 4 common strategy sort of categories that we're handed as calming strategies that tend not to work for people in the audience of this particular YouTube channel or this particular podcast. And remember, I'm always talking about anxiety disorders, chronic states of anxiety where the state itself is the thing that's the problem. And the external trigger either doesn't matter at all or has become a distant second place. We only care how we feel because we learn to fear our own bodies, our own minds, our own thoughts, or our emotions. So if we cannot rely on the most popular categories of calming your feelings, those type of strategies, then how do we calm our feelings? Like, because we all desperately want to do that. How do we calm down when we are triggered? Well, today I really want to talk about Thich Nhat Hanh. Now, you may know Thich Nhat Hanh. He was a Buddhist monk who was written prolifically in wellness and mindfulness, and he's incredibly popular. He was very well respected. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a book called Peace is in Every Step. Peace is Every Step, I'm sorry, is the name of the book. And in that book, I'll give you Reader's Digest version. It's a mindfulness book because everything he wrote is kind of about mindfulness, which is really not necessarily a surprise. But he talks about how learning to be aware of the present and aware of what's going on in a given moment so that we can inhabit that in a kind and non-judgmental way can be really beneficial. And along the way, he talks about calming feelings by learning to be with them. Now, if you've listened to The Anxious Truth or read my books or watched these videos for any length of time, you're going to be like, oh, this again? Yeah, kind of this again. But I want to kind of approach it from a different angle because I didn't invent any of these things. And here's a guy that came up with a really great way, I think, to describe it. So he's not teaching us, Thich Nhat Hanh was not teaching us to calm down by control our feelings or regulate them forcibly or to replace them or to avoid them. He is teaching us to be with our feelings in a kind way, in a recognizing that fear and anger and stress and sadness and other really difficult internal emotions and internal states are part of being human. Like, we learn to be with these feelings by learning to recognize when we're negatively judging them or harshly judging them, and then instantly trying to forcibly push them away using some technique or method or concept like the 4 that I've been talking about. But they're here and they are part of any human experience. Maybe not in the form that they would normally be in, but you're just being human. If you're anxious or afraid today or right now, even while you're listening, that is kind of part of being human. And in an anxiety disorder context, we're always looking at when that state itself gets interpreted as intolerable, or the state itself is a danger. So we're trying to learn to be with these things and in a non-judgmental way so that we can kind of work through them. But we have to become aware of that. And that's where mindfulness comes into the game. But forgetting the mechanics of mindfulness, and by the way, if you're interested in using mindfulness, in anxiety disorder recovery, just go to theanxioustruth.com/mindfulness and you'll find a bunch of resources there where I talk about how mindfulness is connected to acceptance. There's some free downloads, and there's even a workshop that I do with Joanna Hardis and Lauren Rosen. That's a 6-week thing. You can check that out. But that's not the point. Thich Nhat Hanh in Peace is Every Step uses the example of a loving parent. So the loving parent who tries to calm a crying child simply by being with the child, right? Showing acceptance, showing tenderness, allowing the child to cry and letting that experience play itself out because the parent understands that they're going to do that. They're helping to calm the child by just being with the child without judging or trying to coerce the child's state into whatever they think it's supposed to be. They're not harshly judging the child. They're not condemning the child. They're not berating the child. They're not trying to control the child's experience. They're just being with the child until the child gets themselves into a quiet state. Now, that's a good thing, right? You don't have to be a parent to understand the difference between, hey, I understand that you're really upset right now, and that's okay. You can handle that, and I'll stay with you while you do, versus this is unacceptable. Shut up right now. I mean, you don't have to be a parent to know which one is probably the better choice. Yet, as you're listening to me today, and you could say like, yeah, sure, the first one is much better because it's certainly kind, and who would berate a child for being upset? As you listen to me talk about this today or watch me on video, you may discover that you are responding to your own internal experiences, the ones that you hate and fear and find intolerable, exactly that way. If you are trying control-based strategies like the ones I've been talking about, you may find that you are instantly judging your own feelings, the negative ones, the difficult ones, as unacceptable, unpermittable, like something is wrong. This isn't right. What's wrong with me? I have to fix this. And you're berating yourself and trying to browbeat yourself into a state of calm using one of these strategies that just doesn't really work out for us. So are you demanding a way to feel calm right away the minute you are super stressed out or afraid or anxious or triggered, or you just like what you feel? And if you are, like I said before, everybody wants to calm down. So I promise you're not the only one doing this. And you may be listening and say, oh my goodness, I do that. I do treat my anxiety like a parent who yells at a crying child or tries to control the crying child. That's not a deficit or a character flaw. Everybody goes down that road, because if we want to calm down and we're going to try to use what look like common sense approaches to do that, we're all going to sort of wind up in the judgmental control zone as opposed to the kind, non-judgmental acceptance zone. That's pretty normal. But while it does seem like that would be the direction to go in, when we're addressing anxiety disorders, learning to sort of kindly acknowledge what's going on right now and understand that I have to accept these feelings. Yes, even the terrible ones like fear and anxiety, for what they are, because they are in fact here right now. That gives us a far greater chance of ultimately finding that calm state or less triggered state sort of organically, and actually by expending less energy and effort than it does to try to judge it, push it away, and forcibly control it. Again, here we have a paradox, and we're full of that. Paradoxes are like always the soup du jour here on The Anxious Truth. So where am I? 24 minutes. Okay. I'm going to try and wrap it up as soon as I can here. I promise. I might even suggest that when we're trying to learn to calm our feelings, we have to look at the fact that calm comes after capacity, not control. All right. So I'll repeat that. Calm follows capacity, not control. The common sense approaches would tell us to try to control our feelings so that we can forcibly achieve a state of calm. But in the end, if we're going to learn to be kinder, non-judgmental, and more accepting, like the loving parent with a crying child, when we are experiencing difficult feelings and internal states, we discover that we do have the capacity to be with those things and handle them, even when we're 100% sure that we did not have the capacity. So the sort of loving, kind, non-judgmental acceptance approach to difficult internal experiences tends to reveal the capacity that we all desperately need. Like in the end, we learn that we have the capacity to tolerate these things, to navigate through them, to get to the other side. We learn that we have the capacity to not be afraid of our own bodies and minds or emotions anymore. And we actually learn that we have the capacity to act toward what we really value and care about, as opposed to acting against fear and uncertainty and anxiety all the time. There's a big difference between those things, and it really matters, especially in the, improving or recovery process. So if we look back at what Thich Nhat Hanh was saying about the crying child, we can start by recognizing that children are going to cry. Like if you've ever met a child, there's going to be some tears as part of childhood. It's normal. Every human child is going to experience that. And while as a parent or even as a caregiver, an adult in the community, a crying child can certainly be aggravating sometimes, difficult to handle, certainly stressful. That's true. That is true. That doesn't make you cruel. That's just the way we are. That doesn't mean that as adults or parents, we can insist that there be no crying. Like that would be unrealistic and kind of ridiculous, right? So we can understand that a crying child is crying because they're anxious or afraid or uncomfortable or disturbed, or there's some physical discomfort. There's some sort of internal experience happening that is driving those tears. And if we were to insist that those tears are unacceptable, and then demand that there must be a way to instantly turn them off or stop them from happening, then we are denying the actual reality of the natural, expected, like unavoidable internal experiences that child is going to have that's going to drive those tears. And if you were to run across an adult who is berating or punishing or yelling at a child for crying, and therefore for feeling or demonstrating their emotions or their discomfort, you actually might feel compelled to intervene in that. You might want to defend the child or intervene on their behalf in some way. You would probably want to show that child some understanding and kindness. You would not want to see them be berated and forcibly controlled because they're in a state of distress at the moment. So if you would do that for a crying child, why does it seem completely absurd that you might treat the anxious and afraid version of yourself, the triggered version of yourself, the same way? Like a crying child might deserve acceptance and kindness and patience, but the anxious or frightened or triggered version of you must be controlled, judged, coerced, and deemed unworthy or unacceptable. Does that make any sense at all? So in the end, if we're going to try to start to wrap it up, how do you calm your feelings? Like I might suggest, as Thich Nhat Hanh suggested in his book, that you do that by learning to be with them in a kind and accepting way. And I know that sounds like all kinds of woo, and it sounds very fuzzy and like, boy, that doesn't sound like Drew. Hey, you might want to consider this approach simply because if nothing else, it more accurately reflects the reality of being a human being. Like we can fight the reality of having thoughts and emotions and fears and anxieties and discomfort and physical reactions that we hate or fear, or we can learn to work with them and through them in a more adaptive way because they're going to be here no matter what we do, right? So which way might lead to the long-term outcome that we desire? Fighting it or understanding that this is part of every human life, sometimes a more difficult part of human life, and learning to get through it. Now, before I finally wrap it up, because we've gone a little bit longer, of course, a running joke that I do in every episode or every video, I got to acknowledge as always that like kindly accepting and allowing and not fighting and being non-judgmental, those might be a more effective way to achieve a more durable state of calm or at least contentment in the long term. It is true that now, in any given moment now, that is the bigger ask. It is really hard to do that in any triggered moment. You will want to default to negatively judging, this is unacceptable, pushing against it, trying to coerce yourself into some sort of, or berate yourself into some sort of calm state. We have to acknowledge that, because wanting to feel better right now is not a crime or a flaw. So we don't want to beat ourselves up when this happens. If you find that you're defaulting to control and judgmental strategies to try to calm down on demand, well, that doesn't need to be criticized, but we do want to challenge that. And this is where in that challenge, I'm going to get a little cheeky here, we can rely on wisdom handed to us by two reasonably insightful guys, or at least visually interesting guys, who once said, you can't always get what you want, which in this situation would be instant, controlled, coerced calm. They also suggested a few lines down that if you try sometimes you might find that you get what you need, which is the capacity to be with your difficult internal experiences without fighting them, which sort of ultimately in the end leads to that calmer state over time and in a more durable way. This is one of those principles that lies really at the heart. This is at the core of almost everything that I'm writing about, talking about, speaking about when I write books and make videos and podcast episodes or post on social media. So special thanks to Mick Jagger and Keith Richards for that wisdom. It applies in this particular time. So I would ask you as we wrap up to just consider what would happen if you challenged the insistence that everything you dislike inside of you must be evaluated and controlled immediately and forcibly with extreme judgment and extreme prejudice to get to the coveted calm. What might you learn if you challenge that and learn to be a little bit more accepting like the loving parent does with the crying child? And what options might that open up for you, not just in your anxiety journey, but in life in general? So that's how to calm your feelings. We learn to not fight them and we learn to be with them. Who saw that coming, right? How many times have you guys heard me talk about this in one form or another? And today I just wanted to present it this way, maybe in a more comprehensive way. And I dig the way Thich Nhat Hanh did it. The loving parent calming the crying child by just being with them in a non-judgmental, accepting, tolerating kind of way is a really great parallel to what we have to learn to do as anxious people. So that is episode 326 of The Anxious Truth in the books, talking about how to calm your feelings. And it wasn't what you probably expect. I hope you found it useful or helpful in some ways. As we sign off, if you're watching on YouTube, a quick favor, maybe subscribe to my channel, like the video if you really kind of dig it, maybe hit the notification bell so you know when I upload new videos. Liking the video and subscribing does tell YouTube that you care that I took the time to make this video, because it is a lot of work. So you'd be helping me out. And of course, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify as an audio podcast episode and you really dig it, leave a 5-star rating for the podcast, or maybe take a second and write a quick 1 or 2 line review that tells people why you like the podcast, because then it helps other people find the podcast and then more people get help, which is why I fire up this microphone and this camera in the first place. So I really appreciate that. Of course, if you really like The Anxious Truth, you'll also love Disordered. That's the podcast that I do with Josh Fletcher that comes out every week. You can find that at disordered.fm. We talk about similar topics, really the same topics, just in a slightly different way over there. Yeah, so that's it. I hope this episode has been helpful to you. I'll just remind you again that even if it takes you a while to shift from judgmental control to kind, loving acceptance of your difficult internal states, that's okay. Every little shift you make in that direction gets you a little closer to where you're trying to go. And every little shift counts. They kind of add up. So I know you're going to want to be impatient, but you got to try and be kind to yourself and be patient as you make this change, because it's a big shift and it's not really kind of intuitive for a lot of us. So do the best you can. Thanks for hanging out this week. I appreciate it. I'll be back in 2 weeks with episode 327. I'm not sure what it's going to be. I'm going to have a guest, but I'm not sure which guest. So anyway, come back and check it out. If you have any questions, I guess let me know in the comment section, or we're going to have another way to start to do this in the very near future. Josh and I, we're going to have a better way to interact with us. So anyway, I hope this has been helpful. Thanks for hanging out. I will see you in 2 weeks. Take care.